Uh, while we're waiting for people to file in, I'll waste the time with the introductions. This is Ian Williams, President of the Foreign Press Association, and to start the new year, we're very pleased to welcome back Ambassador John Bolton, who's in a sense on a roll with his subjects, because much of what he said is unrolling in front of us now, both in China, Ukraine, Afghanistan, and other places where he has warned against the perils of isolationism and also over-optimistic ideological transformations. His new article in the National Review, which I've just finished reading this morning, does a quick sweep of history, taking in the Battle of New Orleans and Teddy Roosevelt's Great White Stick. And I must say that Teddy Roosevelt is someone I often quote, because his one aphorism that really sticks over the years is that you should speak softly and carry a big stick. And people often sort of forget about the big stick when they advocate diplomacy. So, Ambassador, you are addressing isolation in the context of repeated failed votes in the Congress, a clear failure of any foresight of any kind, because these people were concentrating on very parochial issues. There's no, I'm not sure it's a good or a bad thing. There are no big ideological issues that we can see here. It's some form of inner GOP tribalism that was being exercised while the Democrats were standing by eating popcorn, as all the metaphors and the cartoons had it. So can you expound on your article in the National Review about how American foreign policy is conditioned by these neo-isolationist sentiments?
Right. Well, thanks very much for having me back. Happy New Year to everybody. And I thought it was appropriate to start off by talking about what the new Congress means, because we're also now clearly into the 2024 presidential campaign cycle, and obviously congressional elections for a third of the Senate and the House again in 2024. And there's a lot of media chatter, certainly in the United States, but really around the world, about what's going to happen politically in the United States in the 2023-2024 time period, who's going to get the Republican nomination for president, who's going to get the Democratic nomination for president, what's going to happen with respect to assistance to Ukraine, how are we going to deal with Russia and China. And honestly, there's a lot of nonsense out there about some of the politics, some of the political implications here in this country. And so, as I say, I'd be happy. I don't plan to go on for a huge amount of time here, and I'm happy to answer any questions any of you may have. But I wanted to set the scene, so to speak, and that's really what I tried to do in this National Review article. And I've sent it to Ian. Ian, I don't know if you can get it to your members, but it's on the National Review website. If you're not subscribers, by all means subscribe so you can get through the paywall. I'll warn you in advance, it's long for an article. It's about something over 4,500 words. It's not obviously book length, but it's long enough that it's not a normal op-ed, again, because I thought this required some explanation. And so the issue that prompted me to get into it was the idea that the several mistaken ideas that Donald Trump is still the dominant force within the Republican Party, that he'll be the nominee in 2024, that he has a philosophy, and that there are others in the party who share that philosophy, whatever it is, specifically as it applies to American foreign policy. And what I say in this piece at greater length is, there has long been a fringe isolationist element in the Republican Party. There's also a fringe isolationist element in the Democratic Party, too. They come at it from different sides of the political spectrum, although ironically, they often end up in the same place. And this isolationist impulse, you can debate definitions and taxonomies forever. Well, this guy's an isolationist, but this one isn't. I don't really find that a very profitable enterprise. I think the core isolationist impulse, certainly among conservatives, but on the left as well, is the rest of the world doesn't matter. It only matters what happens in the United States. And that's where we should have our focus, and for different reasons, not worry about the rest of the world. The left thinks the United Nations will take care of the rest of the world. The right doesn't really, the isolationists on the right don't really care who takes care of the rest of the world. But I think the isolationist notion itself rests on a fundamental fallacy, and that is a history, a narrative that, again, ironically, the left and the right join on, is that for well over a century, America existed in a perfect world protected by two broad oceans. We sat by our fireside knitting. We didn't much care about the rest of the world until first St. Woodrow Wilson, followed by St. Franklin Roosevelt, pulled us kicking and screaming into internationalism in the 20th century, from which the isolationists are now trying to retreat. This is a fundamentally misconceived view of American history. It may be disappointing to some Europeans, but my perspective is that the United States, from its inception, has been pushing itself into the outside world, in some cases, whether the outside world was interested in it or not. In fact, after the Treaty of Versailles in 1783 confirmed our independence, the financier of the American Revolution and others put together a ship launched in 1783 called the Empress of China, which sailed in early 1784 for China, making its first appearance as an American vessel there. We fought a quasi-war, as it was called, with France, a naval war in the late 1790s against French privateers. We, the United States, fought the Barbary pirates in North Africa from 1801 forward because the Europeans wouldn't do it. They preferred to pay tribute and ransom. We didn't accept that. That's where our slogan, "Millions for defense, but not 1 cent for tribute," comes from. But from our earliest days, we were fighting in North Africa. That's where the line in the Marines hymn, "From the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli," 1801. Beyond that, we purchased Louisiana from the French in 1803, doubling the size of the country there. We fought the War of 1812, as Ian referenced, confirming our independence and defeating the British, although it was after the peace treaty, but obliterating essentially the British Army at the Battle of New Orleans. We then fought the Mexican War to get the southwestern United States, split the northwestern part of the continent with Britain to finalize the northern boundary, bought several 100,000 acres just to put a railroad through in the Gadsden Purchase of 1853. We paused to fight a civil war in this country, but we didn't slow down. In 1867, Seward's Icebox, Alaska, we purchased from Russia for a pittance, and not a bad thing to have done if you consider the later Cold War period during the 20th century. Then we had an enormous period of industrialization that expanded our trade all over the world. In the meantime, the United States had a Pacific squadron in the early 1800s. Even though we had no states on the Pacific Ocean, we fought a battle in Sumatra in Indonesia in 1830. We had South Atlantic squadrons. We were really all over the world, including in the days of Henry Cabot Lodge and his early incarnation in the Senate, taking Hawaii to make sure the British didn't get it, to set up a system of continental defense. In 1898, we fought the Spanish Empire, what was left of it, defeated them in Cuba, took Guam, the Philippines, Puerto Rico, and Cuba for a time. All of this before Woodrow Wilson was doing anything other than lecturing to students at Princeton University. And that really, it's the Lodge, Theodore Roosevelt view of the world versus the Wilsonian view of the world that I think really sets the tune for Republican and conservative foreign policy. Woodrow Wilson the originator, or at least the most prominent figure in the doctrine of liberal internationalism, another bumper sticker I don't like very much, but it was Woodrow Wilson who said, we're fighting World War I to make the world safe for democracy. Well, Theodore Roosevelt had an answer to that. He said, first, we are to make the world safe for ourselves. He said, this is America's war, and if we don't fight it now, we'll have to fight it later. So I go through this, I call it a Calvin Coolidge length history of the United States, because I think the whole notion that we were a stay-at-home, knit by the fire, isolationist people who couldn't be troubled with the rest of the world, we weren't troubled by the rest of the world. We were troubling them and doing very well. Thank you very much. So this debate has enormous roots in American history. And the isolationists of today, I think, certainly on the Republican side, don't appreciate this history. They don't understand what it means to do strategic analysis. They don't spend any time on it. Their arguments are simplistic. They say, well, we're not controlling the southern border. Why should we worry about the border with Ukraine? As if a failure to handle one policy challenge, the southern border, excuses failing to deal with another foreign policy challenge, the unprovoked Russian aggression against Ukraine. They say, what we're spending all that money overseas when we could spend it at home. For Republicans, that's really ironic because we don't want to spend so much of it at home either. This is a question of priorities, and it's a question of a debate worth having. And I think you can see this is where the influence of Donald Trump has had an effect on the Republican Party, not in a principled way, but in a way of affecting people who are still trying to, I think, show loyalty to Trump, which is another irony since his influence within the Republican Party is fading, I think fading ever more rapidly. I think politically speaking, he's in terminal decline at this point, will not be the nominee of the party in 2024. But this isolationist issue is something I think we should talk about, should debate in the 2024 nomination process. And I'll just tick through a bunch of issues very quickly. And again, happy to address any of them at greater length for those who would be interested. But the greatest example of the failure of Trumpian isolationism is the decision that the Biden administration carried through on to withdraw from Afghanistan and to have NATO withdraw as well. Suffering enormous setbacks in our ability to monitor terrorist activity in Afghanistan, nuclear programs on either side in Pakistan and Iran, opening that part of Central Asia to Chinese and Russian penetration, since any vacuum we create, somebody else is going to fill, providing, again, safe haven for terrorists to come into Afghanistan. And by the way, subjecting the population of Afghanistan to the return of the theological tyranny that the Taliban represents. That's what people want. That's what they think isolationism brings. Obviously, it puts America and America's friends at grave risk, and that's what's wrong with it. People talk about Iraq, for example, as of Trump wanting to end the endless wars. Well, Obama wanted to do that too as a form of democratic isolationism. He called them forever wars, and he withdrew all American forces in 2011, only to have to return them a few years later, and where they still are because of the rise of ISIS. In fact, this was, I think, the refutation of the idea about how to end the forever wars, and we're still seeing the consequences of it today. Now, one example where Trump hasn't changed his mind was he still believes that the Iran nuclear deal was a bad idea. And it just shows this isolationist upsurge in the Republican Party is a function of Trump, because with Trump still saying he doesn't like the Iran nuclear deal, there's no dissent effectively in the Republican Party. And there's still enormous criticism of the Biden administration's efforts to go back into the 2015 nuclear deal. On Ukraine, this is probably the single most visible example of the debate over isolationism. And we just saw it over the weekend in the struggle to elect Kevin McCarthy Speaker of the House, where he has at least committed, he can't force the House, but he can commit to hold a vote on a budget level that the 20 who objected to his selection as Speaker wanted back at the fiscal year 2022 level, which if you interpret that back on defense spending means a pretty substantial cut from what was just appropriated authorized by Congress for the coming fiscal year. Now, that doesn't mean that that's actually going to happen. It means there's going to be a vote on it. And I tell you, there will be, if you think this was messy last week, electing McCarthy Speaker, wait until the fight over that comes. It doesn't say anything about really the ultimate aggregate level of defense spending or anything specific like what assistance to Ukraine would be. But this is a good example of where the battle is being joined right now. I can tell you among both Democrats and Republicans in the House, in the Senate, there remains overwhelming support for helping Ukraine. And I think that's reflected in a number of polls. Some say, but we're not going to give Ukraine a blank check. That's right. I don't want to give Ukraine a blank check. Nobody's asked for a blank check as far as I know. But this is where you need serious debate. And it's where the isolationists essentially fail because they don't do the necessary analysis. And then I'll just close on China, which I think is the existential threat of the 21st century. Even many of the isolationists say, well, we don't disagree on China, although they fail to note that Donald Trump had no time whatever for Taiwan. And I do worry a little bit that some of the isolationists are saying, yeah, China's a serious threat, which they'll say right up until we have to do something about it, which in fact we do. Japanese Prime Minister Kishida is visiting Washington. He'll be here on Friday to meet with President Biden. That was the subject of an op-ed I had in the New York Post today, which I would also encourage you to read. Maybe Ian can send that around too. But there are a number of issues involving what to do with the Asian Quad. We've seen the Japanese not waiting for the United States to exercise a little leadership. A few weeks ago, the Kishida government announced a doubling of Japan's defense budget over the next 5 years. Actually, it'll be more than doubling, but taking it from 1% to 2% of gross domestic product, which of course is coincidentally the NATO target, which will mean more than doubling in actual expenditures, presuming Japan's GDP increases in the next 5 years, which they certainly hope it will. But if they succeed, if they fulfill that commitment in 5 years, that will make Japan's military the third biggest in the world after only the United States and China. That's not a country that thinks peace and sweetness have broken out in East Asia, that's for sure. So there's a lot to discuss about how to deal with the Chinese threat, which really is whole of society. It's not just a military threat. It's not just a political threat. It is an economic threat. And I'd have to say, having watched this, the development of Chinese strategy for a long time, I've revised my own thinking about the nature of what the threat is. I believed back in the 1990s that Deng Xiaoping and the reformers really had cast Marxism aside as a governing philosophy, that they were certainly still authoritarians. But you had Deng Xiaoping saying, it doesn't matter whether a cat is black or white as long as it catches mice, and it's glorious to be rich, and capitalists can join the Communist Party. I thought the ideology was simply a kind of formalism, a screen to be able to say we haven't really changed our minds, despite the fact we've abandoned Marxist economic principles for more free market-oriented principles. I think if you look at the past 3 or 4 years, in particular at Xi Jinping and his activities, his effort to elevate himself to be the equivalent of Mao Zedong, to have Xi Jinping thought equivalent to Mao Zedong thought, which is equivalent to Marx and Lenin in the Chinese lexicon. And the way they talk about the ideology, the re-centralization of political and economic power, which they're engaged in now under Xi Jinping, all leads me to conclude, really, they still believe in this ideology. It's evolved over the past 30 years, that's for sure. But it's not just some Chinese version of authoritarianism. It is Chinese Marxism, or Marxism with Chinese characteristics. And that sense of ideology, I think, is something that we need to take into account. And all of those along China's Indo-Pacific periphery need to take into account too. And again, why I think the 2024 election, I'm about to stop here, but the 2024 election in the US will be more about national security issues than many recent elections, certainly since right after the 9/11 attacks, and perhaps even going back to Cold War days, as people look at this ongoing conflict in Ukraine and the threat posed by China, among many other things. So that's why I think this subject of isolationism and what its role has been in U.S. politics over our history, and what its role is now and what its extent is, was worth taking on. But as I said, I'll stop there and say thanks again for the invitation, and would welcome your questions.
Well, with the sort of refreshing broad brushstrokes that you're producing, there are particular causes and questions where it comes. And one of the issues that's been in the undergrowth and in both Kiev and Washington is just what form of aid is there, because friends of Ukraine point out that the Russians can pour missiles and weaponry in from the whole of the Eurasian landmass, whereas the weapons that are being supplied to the Ukrainian forces have a very limited range. So the Russians are not really paying a price. They can sort of, they have Ukraine besieged, and they can pound the Ukrainians, disable, as we've seen, their power supply, try to demoralize the citizenry. And I see there's no even pretense of winning hearts and minds. Winning hearts and minds does not mean raining scuds down on civilians in cities as a general rule. So Putin's not even pretending that, but except for domestic consumption. So are there concrete measures that you think the Biden administration has failed to, in terms of weaponry that they felt inhibited about providing to the Ukrainians for fear of provocation? Case, I mean, provoking Putin seems a bit.
Yeah. Well,
it's what type of concept is that? How much more can you provoke him?
Yeah. Well, let's be clear. He's the one who's provoked us. He invaded Ukraine. It didn't happen the other way around. And I think this is part of the confusion in the Biden administration's mindset. There's been a lot of self-congratulation, a lot of patting ourselves and NATO members on the back. But I think we have to understand, we have to go back to the beginning. We failed at the beginning. All of us. NATO failed, the United States failed, because we didn't deter the Russian attack. That would have been the outcome, the most desirable outcome. And Putin did not seem at all inhibited. We, on the other hand, have been deterred by him over the course of the last 10 or 11 months in several respects. The fear of provoking a general European war. I mean, I don't know who else Russia thinks they're going to attack. They're not making progress in Ukraine. How they think they're going to make progress somewhere else, certainly in conventional terms, I would like to see. Which brings us to the second fear, the fear of Putin's threats on nuclear weapons, as to which we've had public testimony about this in the United States. We have seen no indication that his nuclear forces have undergone any change in their deployment to bring them to the point where that's a realistic threat. I always take nuclear weapons seriously, but I don't see them being on the table, at least until the point where Putin's regime itself is threatened. And while it's weaker than it was a year ago, it's not at the point, I think, where that's realistic. But we have been deterred by Putin. And that's why much of the alliance's aid to the Ukrainians has been a day late and a dollar short. And it has shown a lack of thinking about what our ultimate objective is and the strategy of how to get there. Part of that was excusable for a while because we thought the Russians were going to walk all over Ukraine. It's public knowledge that when American military and intelligence people briefed Congress a few days after the Russian invasion, they were saying, we think Kyiv will fall in another couple of days and the whole country in a matter of weeks. Remember, even before the invasion, we were talking about provisions for guerrilla forces in Ukraine that would harass the Russians after they had taken over the country. That's what people thought was going to happen. Probably the Russians did too. And when it turned out it didn't, and the provision of intelligence and weapons to the Ukrainians and their own fighting spirit and capabilities stalemated the Russians, we didn't move from the fear of losing entirely to developing a strategy of what we define as victory and how to win. So when we talk about, well, we should give ATACMS, having argued about whether we should give them HIMARS and argued about how many javelins we were going to give them and argued about whether they should get Polish MiG planes, all of these debates are consequential, but they have to be in aid of a strategy to make sense. And there's still no NATO strategy, with all due respect. I will say one unforeseen, at least by me, but potentially enormously significant consequence was the decision by Finland and Sweden to abandon their neutrality and join NATO. I think that's a huge win for the West, a huge loss for Russia. Now we have to do is overcome Turkey's frivolous objections and bringing NATO membership to Sweden and Finland will be a plus that will help us for a long time to come.
Well, sort of in the muddy side bywaters of the conflict, some of us were sweating a bit at the conflict in Kosovo, which almost certainly had Russian fingerprints on it. But somebody pulled, it looks like the regime in Belgrade, the government in Belgrade, decided that they wouldn't play the Russian patsies, despite the pressure from the Serb nationalists in Mitrovica. How serious a threat was that? Because, of course, you know, Sarajevo is in the same region, and we all remember the consequences from 1914, or we should remember the consequences from 1914.
Yeah, well, I don't think we should let the war in Ukraine, as important as it is, distract us from Russian interference in the Balkans. They haven't changed in 100 years, and if not before. So I consider that the United States has not paid enough attention to the Balkans. I did get involved a little bit myself in seeing if I could help Kosovo and Serbia work out their differences. That didn't work, but I think all of us in the North Atlantic ought to be on guard for Russian involvement, because it's not just Ukraine. We know, obviously, the risk of simply incorporating Belarus at a stroke is still there. You've still got Russian forces in Moldova. That remains a frozen conflict. And just in the past year, we've all heard about Russian efforts in a number of NATO members and in former Yugoslavia to cause trouble. So a sound defeat for the Russian aggression in Ukraine is important, obviously, first for Ukraine, but it's important across Eastern and Central Europe, secondarily, and across the world after that. There's nobody following the conflict in Ukraine more closely than the people in Beijing.
Well, Frank Gomez is following on from one of your points there. What are the isolationists hoping to do with Putin's expansionism? Trump and some Trumpists advocate cozy hands-off approach, which basically means let him have what he wants, I presume.
Yeah. Well, you know, Trump could never decide really whether Finland or Ukraine or all those countries, it's all kind of fuzzy in his head. Maybe they were part of Russia to begin with, or why do we really care? And this is part of the mythology that if only we didn't pay attention to the rest of the world wouldn't bother us, which would be nice if we had not been the principal establishers of a global economy. I mean, there were plenty of other people involved, I acknowledge that, but we were the pushy people in the 19th and 20th century who did it because it made the American people richer, better off, living a higher standard of living than anybody in human history. And to say, well, we're just not going to be concerned with what happens some distance beyond America's borders leaves us hostage to that. I'm not saying every policy we've pursued in the past 50 years has been right. But if you want to have a strong American economy, you have to have a strong American presence in the world. And kissing even distant regions goodbye is not going to accomplish that.
Bill Holstein wants to know, what do you think the Chinese have concluded about the desire to invade Taiwan in view of the experience, Russian experience in Ukraine? Has it tempered their ambitions or encouraged them? Bill is a long-standing China watcher, of course.
Yeah, well, I think in terms of Beijing, the grade in Ukraine is incomplete. I don't have any doubt that that they're analyzing different pros and cons, but I also think that their desire to get Taiwan back under their control is very real. I think they are deterrable, however. They don't want to take over a heap of smoking rubble on Taiwan. They want, anybody who's been there knows this incredible mass of productive skills and human ingenuity there. They want all that functioning, especially the semiconductor chip fabrication facilities. So I think we can deter the Chinese.
I think they are deterrable, however. They don't want to take.
I think we've got feedback there, but
in Taiwan, they want. Anybody who's been there knows this incrable mass of productive skills and human ingenuity.
Your words are worth repeating,
especially
but still
semiconductor chip fabrication facilities. Yeah, so I think
sound. Can you work this out?
Chinese.
I think
1 second.
However, they don't want to take.
I think we've got feedback.